from Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. During the first half hour, it's all about wheat management. K-State's Erick DeWolf with several thoughts on planting time disease management for winter wheat, potentially including a fungicide treatment to protect that seed from blight. Eric also puts out the call for you producers to be thinking more about stem rust resistance when adopting new varieties. Then K-State's Dorvar Ruiz-Diaz on starter fertilizer options for winter wheat, the emphasis there on phosphorus and nitrogen applications at planting time. He'll look at the suggested maximum rates to put down depending on soil type and row spacing. And later on then, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas, plus more, right here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and welcome. Glad to have you listening in. Right here, a look to pre-plant disease management for the new wheat crop, and considerations from K-State Research and Extension wheat disease specialist Erick DeWolf across the way now. And when we think about strategizing against diseases in that next winter wheat crop, Eric, it starts, of course, with variety selection.
I think so. Variety choice from a disease perspective is really one of the most important things that we'll do. We control a lot of our diseases, some of the more damaging diseases, stripe rust, leaf rust, barley yellow dwarf, fusarium head blight, can all be controlled to different degrees using genetic resistance. And in some cases, for the rust diseases, may influence whether you need a fungicide or not. So taking a little time to pick a well-adapted, high-yielding variety that has the stripe rust, leaf rust resistance is certainly time well spent. And
that's all documented in the K-State variety field trials each year. So as you go through that information, seek out that resistance factor in the variety of choice there. Some time here on fungicide seed treatments at planting, and talk about the value of that step.
Yeah, so from my perspective, thinking primarily about seed-borne fungi, seed-borne diseases is where I often see these fungicide seed treatments have a major role. Mm-hmm. So every year there's some growers that unfortunately lose their crop, not just experience a small percentage of a loss, but lose their crop outright to a disease called common bunt, or many growers still call it stinking smut. Mm-hmm. And that disease, of course, has a fishy odor to it that is retained all the way through the milling, baking process, and results in bread that also has a fishy odor. So there's pretty strong pushback all the way from the producers, all the way back through the supply chain, all the way back to the growers. So like I said, growers can set themselves up for an outright rejection there. So oftentimes we'll see the seed-borne disease build up over time in a seed lot, maybe particularly in growers that are saving their seed for 3 or more years, is where we often see growers end up with problems there. So certainly the options there are renewing your seed supply on a regular basis, but then also using these fungicide seed treatments can be a very effective way of keeping that off your farm. But if you're just looking for an outright yield improvement, then I think there's a pretty strong interaction between the planting date that you're going to have and whether you're using a fungicide seed treatment or not. So if you're planting your wheat in kind of the ideal time period, long-term K-State data would suggest there's not a huge yield response outright for using these fungicide seed treatments. The reason for that is that wheat has a tremendous ability to stool out or to tiller in the fall. So wheat that's planted with plenty of time to tiller or stool out in the fall can compensate for moderate amounts of stand loss from seed rots or from seedling loss because of that ability to tiller out. However, if we are planting into no-till soils, planting that tend to be cool and wet, that seedling emergence may be slower, seed germination is slower in those cool, wet soils, or we're just planting late, say after soybeans, or if we're planting just late because of other activities that just kept us out of the field or weather conditions weren't conducive. Anytime you're planting wheat late, that of course affects a number of things, right? We've talked about the cool, wet soils and its effect on germination, but also those cooler temperatures also reduce the wheat plant's ability to compensate through tillering or stooling out. And then every seed matters and every plant matters even more, and there is a potentially even higher role for the fungicide seed treatments to play a role in suppressing these seedling diseases.
Think about fungicide seed treatments as an insurance policy for your crop, in essence, then.
Yeah, many growers do choose to look at it that way. I think it can be an insurance policy, and maybe along those lines, we don't necessarily expect a huge payoff from our insurance every year, but it sure is nice to have it when the problem does emerge. You know, some growers I know historically have been a little reluctant to use fungicide seed treatments, especially as the economic profitability of wheat has become questionable in some recent years. So, one way to approach this would be is if you are bringing a new variety onto your farm, and it's a variety that you're thinking of planting as your own seed wheat to increase on your own farm for the subsequent years, then this could be a little higher value for your farm in the future as well. So protecting that seed from these seed-borne diseases or making sure you've got a good stand there could be a place to set some top priorities for using these kind of products to make sure you don't have any problems in your own seed supply for your operation going forward.
Very well. Also in the pre-plant disease management mode, and we've spoken of this time and time again, but producers control that volunteer wheat and suppress the chance for wheat streak mosaic.
This is, we talk about this extensively during the summer months and as we approach wheat planting time because it is so important for controlling wheat streak mosaic, of course, and many of the other viruses in that complex. This is prime time for growers to be out there controlling their volunteer wheat if they haven't already set things in motion, either with herbicides or tillage. I really want to strongly encourage them to get that underway.
This is last call, really.
This is the last call, yeah. This is if you're not going to do it, then that decision may already be made. But if you are going to do it, it's the final reminder to get this done. Ideally, we would have 2 weeks of time when that volunteer wheat is dead and gone. So we need some time for that herbicide to act or tillage to operations to get that volunteer wheat under control before our new wheat crop is emerging.
It's about breaking that green bridge, as we've spoken of so many times before. Well, for the balance of our time here, you wanted to bring up another disease concern in Kansas wheat, although it's been absent in large part for many, many years, as a matter of fact. Stem rust disease may be on the rise as a wheat disease interest in Kansas. Remind us of the nature of this pathogen.
Yeah, so stem rust is yet another rust disease. You know, we certainly talk a lot about stripe rust in recent years, and we've talked a lot historically about leaf rust in the state. Those are our number one and number two diseases in the state. And we haven't talked that much or given that much airtime to the third rust, stem rust. Historically, stem rust has been a major problem in the central Great Plains, and particularly as we go further north from Kansas and Nebraska and into the Dakotas. We've seen some major problems in the past. So by major problems, we're talking taking something that has a 50-bushel yield potential down to 5-bushel yield potential in a very short period of time. So,
basically a wipeout.
Yeah, basically a wipeout or making it not worth the effort to harvest. So this rust is even more damaging than stripe rust that we all know can do quite a number on our wheat crop.
And it can envelop the entire plant, you say, stem rust.
Well, it can affect all the above ground portions of plants. So the name stem rust comes from its ability to attack stems, which differentiates it from these other rust diseases. But it can also attack the leaf sheaths, leaves, heads, and even the awns are also vulnerable to this as well. So it can cause a lot of damage to all the photosynthetic machinery, if you will, of the plants and cause outright destruction of the tissue, leading to yield loss. Or because of the damage on the stems, it can also predispose the plants to lodging as well, which can further complicate harvest as well.
Again, though, it's been absent from Kansas for a long, long while. So what has prompted this renewed interest in stem rust prevention?
Well, so the major concern here is that I guess it's my job as the wheat disease guy for the state here to be monitoring some of these potential vulnerabilities. And it was recently brought to my attention by some colleagues, particularly Alan Fritz and I were discussing some things recently. And,
K-State wheat breeder.
K-State wheat breeder, right, Alan Fritz. And he was describing that based on some calculations that he was doing, that he was finding that more than 30% of the acres in western Kansas were in fact planted to susceptible varieties. So I did a little bit of checking on my own and found that, yes, indeed, Alan was right, and it's closer to 35% of the acres are planted to varieties that are rated 7, 8, or 9, indicating a high degree of susceptibility to stem rust on at least 7 different varieties that are currently on a lot of different acres here. So the major concern here is this is a real emerging vulnerability, and we've, for many years, you've mentioned a couple times, this has really not been an issue for us because we've controlled it with genetic resistance. And I think we're now to the point where we've seen that base of genetic resistance erode considerably, and we've opened the door to a problem that we haven't had to deal with in this generation of growers.
So what is your near-term recommendation to producers in as far as good stewardship tactics against stem rust making a comeback?
Well, this is a tough one, because we haven't seen the threat emerge in causing yield losses right now. But I think it is prudent to begin taking action to begin to correct the problem. So I'm not necessarily advocating that growers drop their varieties in a panic that have been otherwise successful. There's a reason these are out on a lot of acres. But I think as they are looking at taking new varieties onto your farm in the future, either this year or in the coming years, I think this is a criteria that we need to elevate a little bit on our priority list as well. So just begin moving at least a portion of your acres back to stem rust resistant varieties to make sure that you don't have the full degree of vulnerability that on a regional basis really is emerging as a problem.
Well, that stem rust resistance or vulnerability all chronicled once more in the K-State 2018 Wheat Variety Field Trial Report, and you can find that at agronomy.ksu.edu. Incidentally, Eric, thank you for coming over.
You're welcome.
Erick DeWolf, he's a wheat disease specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And Agriculture Today returns after this over the K-State Radio Network.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Yet in advance of the wheat planting season here in Kansas, more input for you producers, this time on the nutrient management angle and looking closely at starter fertilizers for winter wheat. Dorvar Ruiz-Diaz is Mike's side once more. He's a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And starter fertilizers do have their merit when it comes to getting wheat off on the proper start, right, Dorvar?
Yes, Eric. This is a practice that can definitely improve, especially early establishment in winter wheat. Winter wheat is a crop that can respond very well to starter fertilizers, specifically for phosphorus. We're talking about phosphorus, but also for nitrogen early in the season. So having some amount of phosphorus and nitrogen close to the roots in the fall can contribute significantly to early fall tillering, root development, and just general establishment in the fall, and for that crop getting ready for the winter and then in the spring.
Producers are going to try to economize with these starter applications as much as they can without compromising yield potential. That's that delicate balance again, right?
Yes, and by definition, typically when we talk about starter fertilizers, we talk about small amounts of fertilizer that we're putting with the seed. And again, the main objective here is really for that early growth, and in the case of winter wheat for tillering and establishment. So typically, in many cases, especially if we're talking about low testing soil phosphorus, we may be putting the main applications pre-plant perhaps, and putting a small amount with the seed, especially in the case of air seeders. We have the possibility of putting dry fertilizer fairly easy, and so we take advantage of that as well. So it could be complementing basically the fertility program that we'll read during pre-plant. But in some cases, if we don't need a high amount of phosphorus, we can also put 100% of the fertilizer with the seed in the case of winter wheat. And so that's something also to keep in mind. Again, all of that, of course, will depend on the total rate requirements that we have and what kind of application rates we're going to be putting with the seed.
It's all pending on a soil test, isn't it?
Absolutely. So in this case, we are basically looking at soil tests and what kind of rates we're going to be applying for phosphorus specifically.
There are some standard rates that you suggest, maximum rates of fertilizer, if applied directly with the seed, right?
Yes, and one of the rules that we typically follow if we are perhaps using a 7.5-inch row spacing, that will, in medium, fine texture soils, we typically talk about no more than 30 pounds of nitrogen and potassium. And in this case, we're really looking about nitrogen and potassium because these two will contribute to some potential salt damage to that seedling early in the season. So that's very important to keep in mind. In the case of phosphorus by itself is really not causing any damage potentially. But again, we are focusing on that nitrogen and that potassium. So again, maximum of about 30 pounds in a 7.5-inch row spacing in a fine texture soils. If we have a sandy soil, perhaps a dry soil condition, then we need to cut back that, and we typically talk about 20 pounds of nitrogen and potassium in that condition. Again, just because typically the risk of seedling damage tends to be higher in sandy soils and dry soils.
You are being particular, though, about the type of nitrogen you're using. Urea with the seed directly can be problematic.
Yes, that's a very important point. When we're talking about these 30 pounds, for example, of nitrogen and potassium, we're talking about nitrogen source that is not urea. So will not be a urea dry fertilizer or UAN that will have some urea in the composition. And the reason for that is because in the case of urea, we do have an added risk, if you will, because the process of hydrolysis of urea to ammonium that happens in the soil, basically release of free ammonia in the soil, and that's essentially toxic to the seedling. So in addition to this potential salt damage, we also may see toxicity damage basically from that urea hydrolysis process. For that reason, we typically will not recommend any urea applied with the seed in the case of starter fertilizers. We do have some ongoing studies currently collaborating with other colleagues in the department to look at other options, perhaps things like slow-release type urea, coated urea that maybe help us a little bit with safety and minimize potential damage. But again, that's an ongoing study and hopefully something that can help us also to provide more options for producers when it comes to nitrogen. And the main reason we are looking at this is because, like I mentioned earlier, we do see benefit not just from the phosphorus, but also for nitrogen in that early growth and early establishment. So we do want to find a way to put some nitrogen at planting time, especially for those producers who are maybe putting most of the nitrogen at top dress later in the winter, early spring, may not be putting much nitrogen at this time. Again, we're always looking for ways to put some nitrogen. So that's always a question. I typically say I like to have around 30 pounds of nitrogen around planting time, again, just to help with that tillering and establishment early in the season.
Here's a question you say you get from time to time. Can one blend fertilizer directly with the seed in the hopper and apply in that manner?
Yes, that's absolutely that's one approach. We can definitely do that. However, we still need to follow the general guidelines in terms of the application rates that we are looking at. We can definitely do mix the seed with the fertilizer, with the dry fertilizer. If we're using fertilizer like MAP or DAP, the form of nitrogen in those fertilizers are going to be in the ammonium form. There's not going to be urea there, so it's not going to cause necessarily any damage. We can even leave those typically overnight typically without much problems in terms of seedling damage.
So that's something to consider if that's one's option. If you're looking at that pre-plant application, though, the dual placement approach is suitable, you say?
Yes, and again, this goes back to the potential benefit from nitrogen application as well. In this case, if we are using, for example, a more traditional starter fertilizer where we separating the fertilizer from the seed, we can apply higher rates of nitrogen. We can even apply other nutrients as well. Use sources like liquid 1034O for phosphorus fertilizer without any problems. And again, in this case, we're really talking about perhaps what you may call something more like a dribble on the surface or a 2x2 type application where we're separating that seed from the fertilizer. That's something very important to keep in mind. In this kind of situation, we can, again, look at other sources of nitrogen as well, like UAN.
Well, Dorivar, is there any place for secondary nutrients in the starter program here whatsoever? Are they necessary or advantageous in any way?
Yes, absolutely. We can definitely take advantage of this time and also put other sources of other nutrients. And actually, we do have some fertilizer sources that are co-granulated, not just the traditional MAP and DAP sources, but we have some fertilizers that already bring in nutrients such as sulfur and zinc in the same fertilizer grain, basically. So producers are already taking advantage of these kind of sources and can essentially be applied with the seed, typically without any issues, and again can provide those nutrients as well. In our conditions in Kansas, we potentially seeing more benefit from sources like sulfur. We do see more and more need for sulfur in many of our soils for winter wheat, and definitely this one approach, one timing for that fertilizer application.
If, in fact, your soil analysis suggests you need it, of course.
Yes, and this is very important. And again, when we're talking about some of the secondary nutrients, perhaps micronutrients, this becomes really important because the soil types and the soil tests really becomes very important in this case. Not all the soils will be responsive to some of these nutrients. And again, soil types, but also the regions. We do have some parts of the state that tends to be more responsive to sulfur. For example, we have some soil textures that tend to be more responsive to some other nutrients. So again, we have to take those into consideration. Of course, we want to optimize yields, but at the same time, we want to be effective in terms of how we are spending the fertilizer dollars where it's needed in terms of rates, but also in terms of nutrient sources.
And that comes right back to the point. Pencil out your program before you invest in that starter. And more times than not, the starter application will pay dividends, but be sure that it reads that way on paper, Dorivar.
Absolutely. And again, we typically, we do see great benefit in winter wheat, especially when we're talking about phosphorus. We do get benefits in terms of nitrogen. Other nutrients, we need to definitely evaluate the specific condition for that field and whether or not it's going to be needed.
Very well. Producers, be lining that program out here in the coming weeks as we are knocking on the door of winter wheat planting in Kansas. The payoff from starter fertilizer applications to wheat. And Dorivar, as always, thanks for coming over.
Thank you.
Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, our guest on Agriculture Today, crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Incidentally, you might want to look at the article on this topic, Starter Fertilizers for Wheat, in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter series posted on August the 24th. And that's at agronomy.ksu.edu. Now this break. When we return, today's agricultural news headlines are coming your way. And returning once more with another Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vander Hoeven, still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network. Please keep it right here.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And now, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the weekly Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report from the USDA delayed a day by the Labor Day holiday. For the week ending this past Sunday, the topsoil moisture supplies in the state at 7% surplus and 77% adequate, 16% short to very short, while subsoil moisture 3% surplus and 73% adequate, only 24% still short to very short. Winter wheat planting underway to the tune of 1% as of this past weekend. That's right on the average for the date. The condition of the Kansas corn crop, 44% good to excellent, 28% fair, and 28% poor to very poor. Corn in the dough stage at 95%, near the average, dented at 81%, ahead of the 70% average, and corn now mature at 36%, well ahead of the 21% average. Corn harvesting at 6%, that's near the average for the date. The soybean crop condition in Kansas then at 49% good to excellent, 36% fair, 15% poor to very poor. Soybeans setting pods at 93% and beans dropping leaves at 10%, both near the average. And grain sorghum conditions in the state, 66% good to excellent, 26% fair, only 8% poor to very poor. Sorghum headed 96% now, and sorghum coloring at 60%. That's ahead of the 47% average. Grain sorghum now mature at 6%. That's near the average, and there is some harvesting. 1% of the sorghum crop has been cut. Range and pasture conditions, 38% good to excellent this week, 35% fair, and 27% poor to very poor around Kansas. For the updated look at corn and soybean conditions nationally now, here's the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Looking at the condition ratings of corn and soybeans now versus this time a week ago nationally.
Really, if you look at the Midwest, the major production areas there, didn't really see much change.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says condition of the corn down just a smidge from a week ago.
Just a 1-point drop in the good to excellent rating for corn, down a point to 67%. No change in the very poor to poor rating, steady at 12%.
But all that rain lately, too late for that crop in Missouri.
Missouri comes in still rated as the lowest condition state for corn, 40% very poor to poor.
But rains did help the Missouri soybeans.
Crop in Missouri, only 28% very poor to poor. That may not sound like much, but last week we were at 36%.
And for the nation's soybean crop as a whole?
For the second week in a row, we come in at 66% good to excellent, 11% very poor to poor.
Development of both corn and beans still well ahead of average. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
After U.S. net farm income rose slightly in 2017, the USDA's Economic Research Service is forecasting it will fall this year, though it will remain slightly above the 13-year low seen in 2016. Overall, net farm income for 2018 is forecast by the USDA at $65.7 billion, down nearly 15% from 2017. However, it remains above the $64 billion seen in 2016. That was the lowest level since 2002. All of the figures are adjusted for inflation. The total value of U.S. agricultural production in 2018 is expected to decrease compared with last year, with a combination of lower cash receipts, higher production costs, lower government payments, and other factors weighing on net farm income. Meanwhile, 2018 net cash income forecast to come lower year over year at just $91.5 billion. That compares with the net cash income of $106 billion seen in 2017 and $98 billion recorded for 2016. It would represent the lowest level of net cash farm income recorded since 2009 in real dollar terms. However, these 2018 forecasts do not include upcoming payments under the Market Facilitation Program announced back in July. The ERS forecast developed assuming a continuation of existing policies. It was too early to tell how many producers would complete the MFP enrollment process and receive a payment in 2018 versus 2019, or how the eligibility criteria would impact total levels of payments issued, which would change with the calendar year 2018 farm income totals. The beef checkoff is helping influence the next wave of consumers who will make beef buying and preparation decisions. Todd Domer reports here that One Kansas program is now reaching thousands of young people in that cause.
The Kansas Beef Council's Beef Certificate Program offers beef education, resources, and reimbursement to Kansas high school and middle school family and consumer science classrooms. Reimbursement funds provided through the checkoff-funded program support purchases of beef used for classroom lessons about lean beef selection, storage, preparation, and nutrition. Updates to the program for the current school year include improved communications with family and consumer science teachers, a streamlined online application and reimbursement process, and website updates with classroom resources. To date, 136 Kansas high schools and middle schools have applied for the 2017-2018 Beef Certificate Program. Teachers have reported 16,466 students from across the state were reached, with an average cost per student of just $1.26. Two Kansas teachers recently were recognized for exceptional beef lesson plans through the Beef Certificate Program. Bridget Heyer of Seaman High School in Topeka and Sherry Haskett of Skyline Schools in Pratt received additional funds to be used for classroom supplies. Kansas Beef Council Director of Nutrition Abby Hadari attended the Kansas Association of Teachers and Family and Consumer Science Resource Fair in Manhattan at the end of July. She provided teachers with updated information on the program. Teachers relayed positive feedback on the digital expansion of the program and emphasized the need for classroom resources and lesson plans. In response to teacher feedback, the 2018-2019 Beef Certificate Program will include distribution of the True Beef DVD with standardized lesson plans. I'm Todd Domer.
And the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service has sent a final GMO disclosure rule to the White House Office of Management and Budget. That's a move that suggests the much-anticipated regulation may be finalized yet this year. The AMS sent the final rule to the OMB's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs last Friday, and the White House budget staff's approval should be the final step before the National Bioengineering Food Disclosure Standard, as it's called, is published in the Federal Register. The 2016 law created the first federal standard for disclosing the presence of genetically engineered crops in foods and ingredients. This is Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
Yes, we needed the rain, but not all in one big downpour.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Some time ago, I received an interesting email, and any Kansan who ever drove a truck on deeply rutted dirt road will understand. If, on the other hand, all you drive is on concrete or asphalt, you'll have to use your imagination about the why. Why? But those who drive dirt roads, in winter especially, to feed cattle or simply to get from here to there, will have experienced the jarring of wheels and steering mechanism of trucks when in wintertime farm roads have thawed out and have become slushy with soft mud. It doesn't take long to drive deep ruts in such a road, and if the ground freezes over during another cold spell, those ruts are a pain in the neck. However, if you can steer your truck into the same rut, you actually can let go of the steering wheel and your wheels will follow the track. It works. I've tried it. Of course, don't drive too fast, and it may not be good for your steering mechanism, but it's fun to try. Rutted roads at one time were very serious business, of which, according to this article, the results are still with us today. I'll explain. The United States standard railroad gauge, width between the two rails, is 4 feet 8.5 inches. That's an exceedingly odd number. Why was the gauge used? Because that is the way they built them in England, and the United States railroads were built by English expatriates. Why did the English build them like that? Because the first rail lines were built by the same people who built the pre-railroad tramways, and that's the gauge they used. Why did they use that gauge then? Because the people who built the tramways used the same jigs and tools that they used for building wagons, which used that wheel spacing. Why did the wagons have that particular odd wheel spacing? Well, if they tried to use any other spacing, the wagon wheels would break on some of the old long-distance roads in England, because that's the spacing of the wheel ruts. So who built those old rutted roads? The first long-distance roads in Europe and England were built by the Imperial Rome for their legions. The roads have been used ever since. And the ruts in the road, Roman war chariots first formed the initial ruts, which everyone else had to match for fear of destroying their wagon wheels. Since the chariots were made for or by Imperial Rome, they were all alike in the matter of wheel spacing, like you might say our Jeeps were. The United States standard rail gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches derives from the original specifications for an Imperial Roman war chariot. Specifications and bureaucracy live forever. So the next time you're handed a specification and wonder what horses behind came up with it, you might be exactly right, because the Imperial Roman war chariots were made just wide enough to accommodate the back ends of 2 war horses pulling the chariot. And 2,000 years later, American rockets. When we see a space shuttle sitting on a launch pad, there are 2 big booster rockets attached to the sides of the main fuel tank. These are solid rocket boosters, or SRBs. The SRBs are made by Tharkol at the factory in Utah. The engineers who designed the SRBs might have preferred to make them a little bit fatter, but the SRBs had to be shipped by train from the factory to the launch site. The railroad line from the factory had to run through tunnels in the mountains. The SRBs had to fit going through those tunnels. The tunnels are slightly wider than the railroad track, and the railroad track is about as wide as 2 horses' behinds. So, the major design feature of what is arguably the world's most advanced transportation system was determined more than 2,000 years ago by the width of a horse's behind. And you wonder why it is so hard to get ahead in this world. The worst ruts I've ever driven were in Australia, with an old World War II Jeep, which was salvaged out of New Guinea. Each morning and evening I drove an old farm road with that Jeep, loaded with milk cans we now buy at an antique store. Driving that road, the milk would slush, slush, and slush as I navigated the deeply eroded ruts downhill from the hill farm. Each time it was a 10-minute joyride down and back up again. I'm sure that the old Jeep was not built to Imperial Rome chariot wheel spacing standards. On the other hand, maybe it was. Anyway, I still remember the jarring rides and the whining noise of the Jeep's engine, as it climbed the road back up the hill. Now, with the abundance of rain we have just received here in Manhattan, 5.5 inches on the hill and 8+ inches in town, I'm sure that some farm roads are now in a deplorable state. The best is to stay off the land, but those who need to feed or check on cattle, drive the loaded truck or tractor and feed wagon, will cut deep sliding ruts. It will be a mess. The ruts may follow watercourses and erode deeper. These are times that a good horse might be better than a growling 4x4 truck. Whatever, don't get stuck. Yes, we needed to rain, but not all in one big downpour.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas. Our time's away for today. As always, thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.